Have you ever heard of Viking warriors so fierce, they could charge into battle alone, feeling no pain, no fear, and somehow surviving wounds that should have killed them? These weren't just myths or legends whispered around ancient campfires, they were real, and their names, berserkers, Ulfhedner, and more, still echo through history like a war cry. In today's video, we're diving deep into the world of the most terrifying Viking warriors ever recorded. These were fighters who blurred the line between man and beast, pushed the limits of human strength and psychology, and used both fury and strategy to dominate the battlefield. So grab a blanket, settle in, and get ready for a wild journey into Viking history like you've never heard before. This isn't your average bedtime story, it's a storm from the north. The raid that shook Europe. The morning of June 8, 793, started like any other on the remote island of Lindisfarne, off the northeastern coast of what is now England. The monks at the island's monastery followed their daily routines, morning prayers, tending to manuscripts, working in the gardens, feeding the poor. The sea breeze was brisk, the sky gray with mist, and the world felt, at least for a while, peaceful. But just beyond the horizon, a storm was already forming, not one of wind and rain, but one of iron, fire, and blood. That morning, longships appeared in the distance. At first, they might have looked like traders or travelers. After all, the monastery had seen visitors before. But these ships moved quickly, cutting through the waters with an unnatural urgency. And the men aboard them were not here to trade, they were Vikings. No one at Lindisfarne had ever seen warriors like these before. They stormed the shore with wild cries, armed with axes, spears, and blades unlike anything the monks had ever witnessed. Their appearance was terrifying, shaggy hair, painted faces, animal furs clinging to their bodies. Some of them howled like beasts. Some moved with a terrifying silence. And all of them carried one thing in common: fury. The Vikings tore through the monastery, looting its treasures, slaughtering the defenseless monks, and destroying sacred relics that had stood untouched for generations. The church bells that once called for prayer now rang in alarm, until even those fell silent. What happened that day was not just an attack. It was a message. A declaration. The age of the Vikings had begun. Before Lindisfarne, most of Europe saw the North Sea as a boundary, something that protected them from the harsh, frozen lands beyond. The Scandinavian people were considered distant and primitive, their lands cold and unforgiving, their beliefs pagan and strange. No one expected that from such a place, an unstoppable force was preparing to crash against the shores of Christendom. But Lindisfarne changed everything. News of the raid spread like wildfire across Europe. Monasteries and villages that once thought themselves safe began to pray not just for salvation, but for survival. And it wasn't just the brutality that terrified them. It was the nature of the attackers. The chroniclers of the time didn't hold back. To them, these men weren't just warriors. They were monsters. Beasts. Demons in human skin. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written not long after the raid, described heathen men who miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter. Another monk wrote that the skies turned red, as if God himself had turned his face away from the world. But here's what's often overlooked: the Vikings didn't just appear out of nowhere. What happened at Lindisfarne was the result of generations of survival, training, and adaptation in one of the harshest environments on Earth. Scandinavia in the 8th century was no gentle homeland. Winters were long and brutal, farmland scarce, and life was a daily battle against nature itself. To thrive there, you had to be tough. To lead, you had to be stronger than everyone else. And to make your mark, you had to be willing to do what others would not. The warriors who landed on Lindisfarne were forged in this crucible. Some of them might have been fishermen. Others, farmers. But many, especially the most terrifying among them, were something else entirely. Berserkers. Ulfhedner. Men who had trained to fight not just with muscle, but with mind and spirit twisted into something unrecognizable to the civilized world. They didn't fight like traditional soldiers. They didn't care about formation, about honor in battle. They overwhelmed their enemies with speed, chaos, and fear. Some seemed to fight in a trance, unflinching even when wounded. Others moved like predators, flanking and surrounding their prey. Lindisfarne, in hindsight, was just the beginning. Over the next few centuries, Viking raids would spread across the coasts of England, Ireland, and France. Their longships would sail up rivers and storm cities deep inland. Great kingdoms would rise and fall under the weight of their axes. And while not all Viking warriors were like the ones at Lindisfarne, the memory of that first raid, the shock of it, would haunt Europe for generations. What made that day so unforgettable wasn't just the bloodshed or the destruction. It was the realization that something had changed. A new force had entered the stage of history, one that didn't play by the old rules. And perhaps most terrifying of all, no one knew when, or where, they would strike next. Looking back, Lindisfarne was the spark that lit a firestorm. But to understand why that fire burned so long and so fiercely, we need to understand the warriors who started it. Not just as invaders, but as products of a brutal world, shaped by gods, nature, and centuries of survival. Because the truth is, the most terrifying part of the Viking warriors wasn't just what they did, it was what they believed they were becoming. And in the next part of this story, we'll meet the men who embodied that belief, those who became something more than human. Or perhaps, something far less. Berserkers, the warriors who felt no fear. If the raid on Lindisfarne was a thunderclap, the warriors leading the charge were lightning. And among them, one kind stood out, not just for their strength, but for something far more unsettling. They were called berserkers. Even today, the word berserk means to lose control, to go into a rage so wild that nothing can stop you. But few realize that the word comes from these very warriors. In the Viking Age, berserkers weren't just fighters. They were a phenomenon. A force of nature. And to those who faced them in battle, they were pure terror made flesh. So who were they, really? Some say the name berserker comes from bear shirt, suggesting they wore the hides of bears into battle, not just for armor, but as a way to channel the spirit of the beast. Others argue it meant bear shirt, implying they fought without armor at all, trusting their rage more than any shield. Either way, the meaning is clear: these were men who aimed to become something more, or less, than human. Eyewitness accounts from the time describe berserkers as entering a kind of trance before battle. They would shake, froth at the mouth, bite their shields. Their eyes would glaze over, as if they were no longer fully present in the world. Then, when the moment came, they would charge with a fury that defied explanation, screaming, smashing, tearing through enemy lines with almost supernatural force. And what's more, they didn't seem to feel pain. Arrows would strike them. Blades would cut them. But they kept going. Sometimes, they didn't even notice the wounds until long after the fighting was done. To those watching, it was like the gods themselves had taken over their bodies. To those fighting them, it was horrifying. But this rage, this berserker gang, as it came to be called, didn't happen by accident. It was carefully crafted, almost ritualized. Berserkers were trained, not just physically, but mentally and spiritually. The process was brutal. It involved sleep deprivation, intense physical hardship, and long periods of isolation. Some were forced to live alone in the forests, surviving like animals, learning to trust their instincts more than their thoughts. Many also practiced sacred rites dedicated to Odin, the Norse god of war and wisdom. Odin wasn't a warm or comforting deity, he was a god who valued sacrifice, chaos, and cunning. He was the god who gave up his eye for knowledge and hung himself from a tree to understand the runes. His warriors were expected to give up just as much. And the berserkers? They were his most feared instruments. Some scholars believe that berserkers may have used natural substances to help induce their frenzied state. One theory points to Amanita muscaria, a type of hallucinogenic mushroom found in northern forests. Taken in the right amounts, it could cause intense physical stimulation, altered perception, and feelings of invincibility. Of course, it could also cause nausea, delirium, or worse, but for the berserkers, that might have been part of the point. They weren't trying to feel good. They were trying to become something else entirely, a creature unafraid of death. A tool of the gods. A walking nightmare. On the battlefield, berserkers weren't just dangerous because they were strong. They were dangerous because they were unpredictable. Enemies didn't know how to fight them. You couldn't reason with a man in a frenzy. You couldn't scare someone who no longer felt fear. And worst of all, their presence often shattered morale. Soldiers who might have stood their ground against an ordinary Viking could panic at the sight of just one berserker. That's why they were often used in the front lines, not just to kill, but to break the enemy before the real fight even began. Imagine standing in formation, gripping your spear, watching a wave of enemies approach. Then you see him. One man, sprinting ahead of the others, screaming like an animal, blood smeared across his chest, teeth bared. You stab, but he doesn't stop. You wound him, but he doesn't fall. He grabs your shield, rips it from your hand, and the next thing you know, the line has broken. The army collapses. All because of him. That was the psychological power of the berserker. And yet, there's a kind of tragedy to them, too. These weren't just wild men who lost control. They were trained to lose control. Conditioned, over years, to abandon their sense of self and become instruments of war. In a way, they sacrificed more than their lives, they gave up their humanity. For Odin. For glory. For survival. Not every Viking was a berserker. They were a class of their own. Feared. Respected. And sometimes, even by their own people, avoided. After all, what do you do with a man who forgets who he is? Who might still be snarling when the battle's over? Who might not know the difference between an enemy and a friend when the blood rage sets in? Over time, stories of berserkers became legendary, warriors who fought off entire battalions, men who couldn't be killed, beasts in human form. And as we'll see later, those stories weren't just fantasy. Some of them were painfully real. But before we move on, let's be clear, berserkers weren't superheroes. They weren't magical. They were men. Men shaped by one of the harshest environments on earth, trained in violence, forged by pain, driven by belief, and turned into tools of terror. And maybe that's what makes them so unforgettable. Because if ordinary people can become monsters through enough suffering, training, and belief, what does that say about the rest of us? Coming up next, we'll meet their quieter cousins. Just as deadly, but far more calculated. The wolves who hunted in silence. Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior poet. If berserkers were living weapons, blunt, furious instruments of chaos, then Egil Skallagrimsson was something far more complicated. He was sharp. Violent, yes, but also thoughtful. A man who could kill in the morning and compose haunting poetry by sunset. To call him a paradox doesn't go far enough. Egil wasn't just a warrior. He wasn't just a poet. He was a creature torn between worlds, between savagery and sensitivity, instinct and reflection, destruction and creation. And perhaps that's what made him so unforgettable. He was born in Iceland around the year 904, into a family already known for its strength and strange temperament. His father, Skallagrim, was a powerful man with a temper that ran hot and cold. From a young age, Egil showed signs of being different. By the time he was 3, he was composing verses. By the time he was 7, he had killed a boy with an axe. That was Egil in a single breath, brilliant and brutal. And as he grew, so did his reputation. He fought with the fury of a berserker, there's little doubt about that. He was tall, broad, wild-eyed, and when the blood rage took over, he became nearly unstoppable. In battle, he didn't just win. He overwhelmed. Slashed through armored men like they were straw. He didn't hesitate. didn't flinch. He lost teeth, broke bones, took blows that would have ended other men, and kept going. There's a story that during one battle, he was wounded so badly, most thought he was dead. And yet, he rose again. Not slowly, not groaning, but with a terrifying force, as if pain had simply given up trying to control him. He roared back into the fight with the kind of fury that made even seasoned warriors step back. But here's the twist. When the blood dried and the battlefield was quiet, Egil would pick up a quill. He wrote poetry. Not simple chants or victory songs, but deep, emotional verse. Complex meter, rich language, themes of loss, longing, love, grief. Some of his poems still survive today, and they're among the most celebrated in all of medieval Norse literature. He wrote elegies for fallen brothers, insults for kings, prayers for mercy, and laments that read like the tears of a man carrying too many ghosts. In one of his most famous compositions, Sonatarek, Egil mourns the death of his son with an honesty that cuts through time. He speaks of the ocean taking what he loved most. Of being ready to die. Of how even Odin, the god he had long worshipped, had failed him in that moment. This wasn't the voice of a bloodthirsty warrior. It was the voice of a grieving father. How can one man live with so much contradiction? That's the question Egil forces us to ask. He had a mind as sharp as his blade. He negotiated with kings. He insulted tyrants through verse that was as dangerous as any spear. When one king ordered his execution, Egil offered a poem in his defense so powerful, so eloquent, the king not only spared him, but rewarded him. Who else in history has survived a death sentence with nothing but poetry? And yet, for all his intelligence, Egil never softened. He remained volatile. Sometimes cruel. Prone to black moods and brutal decisions. He could be generous and warm to those he loved, and terrifyingly cold to those who crossed him. Some said he was cursed. Others said he simply lived too deeply, felt too much. In many ways, Egil Skallagrimsson embodied the Viking spirit more fully than anyone else. He wasn't just a raider or a killer. He wasn't just a man of words. He was both. He carried the violence of the age in one hand, and the soul of it in the other. His saga, Egil's saga, is one of the great Icelandic epics. It tells of feuds, battles, poems, and heartbreak. And while it certainly exaggerates at times, the man behind the legend is unmistakable, someone who refused to be defined by a single role. Someone who lived every part of himself, no matter how messy or painful or dangerous it was. And maybe that's why we still talk about him today, because Egil reminds us that human beings are rarely simple. That even the fiercest warrior might carry a wounded heart. That rage and tenderness can live side by side. That grief can make a man as strong, or as broken, as steel. There's a line in one of Egil's poems that, loosely translated, reads, "The gods made me this way. I bear their marks, and I do not beg for peace." It's hard to think of a line more fitting. Egil Skallagrimsson wasn't just a berserker. He wasn't just a poet. He was both. He didn't fight to conquer. He fought because the storm inside him left no other choice. He didn't write to soothe. He wrote because the pain demanded to be spoken. And when you look at his life as a whole, scarred by violence, lit by brilliance, and shaped by contradiction, it's clear he wasn't a myth. He was a man. A man who left behind more than broken shields and bloodied swords. He left behind his words. And sometimes, that's the most lasting weapon of all. Egil Skallagrimsson, the warrior poet. Among the many names whispered through the sagas of the Viking Age, one stands apart, not just for the blood he spilled, but for the verses he left behind. His name was Egil Skallagrimsson, and he was something rare. Something that almost didn't make sense. A man who could fight like a beast, but write like a soul haunted by stars and silence. He was a berserker, yes. A killer, a brawler, a survivor of battlefields soaked in mud and blood. But he was also a poet, perhaps one of the greatest poets Scandinavia has ever produced. And in him, those two forces, violence and beauty, didn't cancel each other out. They lived side by side, feeding off one another like twin wolves beneath the skin. Egil was born in Iceland around 904 AD, into a family that was already known for its fierce temper and hard hands. His father, Skallagrim, was a man feared even among his own people. From the beginning, Egil was different. Brilliant, violent, stubborn. According to his saga, he composed his first poem at the age of 3. At 7, he killed a boy during a game. Not out of accident, but because he felt insulted. That was Egil, a child with the instincts of a warrior and the mind of an artist. As he grew, those instincts sharpened. He became a true Viking warrior, traveling, raiding, fighting in distant lands. He fought not only with weapons, but with fury. When the berserker rage took hold of him, a deep, uncontrollable trance of blood and chaos, he became almost untouchable. His enemies called him a monster. His allies kept their distance. And yet, between battles, he would sit by the fire, pulling together words that wrapped his grief, rage, and wonder into verse. There's a raw, almost mythic power in the stories told about him. One tale speaks of him being so badly wounded in battle that those around him thought he was done for. But Egil refused to die. He got back up. He kept fighting. It wasn't just stubbornness, it was something deeper, something almost spiritual. As if his soul had tethered itself to battle, to struggle, to the act of surviving no matter the cost. And when the blood stopped flowing, when his heart stopped pounding, he would write. That's what made him terrifying, not just his strength, but his depth. His enemies feared him not only because he could kill, but because he understood what killing meant. He didn't fight blindly. He fought with purpose. And he remembered every wound, every betrayal, every loss. He turned them into poetry that still echoes centuries later. His most famous work is a poem called Sonnetarek, which means loss of sons. He wrote it after losing his son to the sea, a death that shattered him. In the poem, Egil speaks not like a warrior, but like a broken father. He curses the gods. He mourns the silence of his household. He speaks of the weight of grief like an axe across his shoulders. And yet, there is a terrible grace in his words. A rhythm that feels like waves crashing on a black shore. Few warriors in history have ever shown such vulnerability. Fewer still have captured it so beautifully, but even his softer side didn't make him gentle. Egil had a reputation for being volatile. He could be warm and generous to those he loved, and cruel and dangerous to those he didn't. He once killed a man for insulting his poetry. Another time, he carved a curse into a whalebone and planted it at the home of a rival, hoping to bring down disease and disaster. In one extraordinary moment, Egil found himself sentenced to death by a king. The reasons were political, old grudges, insults, the kind of entangled feuds that filled the north like fog. But rather than beg for mercy or draw his sword, Egil composed a poem. Right there, in front of the court. It wasn't a plea. It was a portrait, of loyalty, of strength, of identity. It was so powerful that the king spared his life. What other Viking could say they talked their way out of execution using nothing but their own words? And still, Egil never stopped being a fighter. He lived long past the age most warriors die, enduring loss after loss. His saga, Egil's saga, tells of dozens of feuds, betrayals, alliances, and battles. It also tells of his slow fading. The way his hands grew stiff with age. The way his anger cooled into sadness. The way his poems grew more personal, less political. Toward the end of his life, he was nearly blind. Alone. A man who had seen too much, survived too much. But even then, his mind stayed sharp. He was still composing verse when others thought he could barely speak. In Egil, we see the full spectrum of what it meant to be human in an age of war. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't noble. He was cruel, brilliant, jealous, brave, sorrowful, and wild. He carried the bloodlust of the old gods and the soul of a man trying to make sense of a brutal world. His poetry was a shield against grief. His rage, a weapon against despair. And maybe that's why we still remember him, not just as a warrior, but as a warning. A reminder that no man is ever just one thing, that even in the heart of the fiercest berserker, there may live a voice quietly composing verse. That beneath the scars and broken bones, there might be words waiting to be spoken. Egil Skallagrimsson didn't fight because he hated peace. He fought because war was the only place where he could truly be himself. And when the battles ended, when the axes dropped and the blood dried, he did what no one expected. He picked up his pen, and made history. Thorkel the Tall, the giant commander. If the Viking Age had generals in the modern sense, men who didn't just charge into battle but shaped its very rhythm, then Thorkel the Tall would be one of its clearest examples. He wasn't a berserker, nor did he claim to be possessed by animal spirits. He didn't fight in a trance or howl at the moon. No, Thorkel was something different. Something rarer, and perhaps more dangerous. He was a commander. A strategist. A living tower of a man with a mind as sharp as any blade and a presence so vast that his name alone could change the course of a campaign. Most warriors of his time were known for chaos, quick raids, violent ambushes, unrestrained fury. But Thorkel brought order to the madness. Under his command, Viking warfare began to evolve. It became less like a storm and more like a chess match, deliberate, precise, devastating. Thorkel led the Jomsvikings, a legendary band of elite mercenaries whose loyalty wasn't bought with coin alone, but with honor, discipline, and an unshakable code. The Jomsvikings were the closest thing the Viking world had to professional soldiers. They lived in a fortified stronghold. They trained relentlessly. They followed commands without question. And Thorkel led them like a man who had seen the future and built an army to survive it. They say Thorkel stood a full head taller than the tallest of his men. A literal giant. Not just in frame, but in presence. When he rode into a village at the head of his column, people didn't just see a Viking, they saw the future of war walking on two legs. There are stories of entire towns surrendering at the mere sight of him. Not because he looked cruel, but because he looked inevitable. But his true genius wasn't in fear, it was in structure. Thorkel was among the first to organize Viking raids like military campaigns. Instead of a handful of longships crashing into a coastline for a night of looting, Thorkel's forces moved in coordinated waves. They scouted, planned, executed with chilling precision. Villages weren't just pillaged, they were strategically dismantled. Supply lines were cut. Forts were surrounded. Communications between local lords were interrupted. Thorkel didn't just take what he wanted, he made sure no one could stop him from doing it again. He had an almost uncanny ability to read a battlefield. His men said he could sense weaknesses in enemy formations like a wolf sniffing out fear. He would wait. Hold. And then, when the time was right, he would unleash his forces with terrifying momentum. Not with rage, but with calculation. Like a hammer dropped from a great height. And yet, Thorkel wasn't just a cold mind behind the curtain. He fought. Always at the front, always visible. His massive frame made it impossible to hide anyway. But he seemed to prefer it that way. He wanted his men to see him there, standing like a wall between them and death. His sword was just as deadly as his orders. And when he roared across the field, even seasoned warriors paused to listen. His legend spread across the North Sea like fog on the tide. He fought the English, the Danes, and even other Viking lords when necessary. Sometimes for money. Sometimes for power. But always on his own terms. In one of the most famous episodes of his life, Thorkel served the English king Athelred, fighting against his fellow Norsemen. That alone would have made him controversial. But Thorkel didn't care for politics. He cared for the art of war. For the perfection of command. Later, he switched sides and aligned with King Knut the Great, the Danish ruler who eventually claimed the English crown. And under Knut's rule, Thorkel was made Earl of East Anglia, a massive region in England, and trusted with holding it against rebellion. The warrior became a governor. The raider became a ruler. That transformation didn't happen often in the Viking world. Most warriors died young. But Thorkel adapted. He evolved. And because of that, he endured. But even men like Thorkel aren't invincible. Over time, his legend began to fade. New kings rose. New wars broke out. And the chaos he once mastered began to shift beneath his feet. He died sometime after 1023, his final years lost to silence. No glorious final stand. No last charge into the fire. Just stillness. But if you listen closely, you can still hear echoes of him. In every disciplined army. In every war council before a campaign. In every commander who values timing over rage, strategy over ego. Thorkel showed the Vikings that brute force wasn't the only path to victory. That thinking men could win wars just as effectively as bleeding men. He was the blueprint for a new kind of warrior. Not just big and brave, but smart. Composed. Dangerous in a different way, and perhaps that's why his name still carries weight, even now. Because in a world where chaos reigned, Thorkel the Tall stood as proof that order, when wielded by the right hands, could be just as terrifying. He didn't howl into battle. He didn't wear a bear skin or chant Odin's name. He just looked at the enemy, gave the order, and watched the world fall into line. The mind behind the madness, the science of berserker rage. For centuries, the stories of Viking berserkers, those wild, unchained warriors who stormed into battle with fire in their eyes and seemingly no regard for pain, have teetered between myth and mystery. Were they possessed by gods? Driven by magic mushrooms? Or perhaps just madmen too far gone to know fear? But in the quiet corners of modern neuroscience labs, where battles are measured in brainwaves and hormones, a new picture is beginning to emerge. One that doesn't dismiss the legends, but reframes them. One that asks, what if going berserk wasn't supernatural at all? What if it was a kind of ancient neurohack? A trick of the brain that the Vikings may not have understood, but certainly knew how to trigger. Let's start with the feeling. Witnesses described the berserkers as being not quite human when they fought, foaming at the mouth, trembling with rage, immune to wounds that would stop any normal man. They seemed to enter a trance. Their eyes glazed over. Their minds left their bodies. But their bodies kept going. Today, scientists believe that state might have a real name, transient hypofrontality. It sounds like a mouthful, but the concept is surprisingly simple. In moments of extreme stress or focus, the brain temporarily turns down activity in the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for decision-making, rational thought, and self-awareness. That's the part of your mind that says, maybe I shouldn't do this. When it goes quiet, instinct takes over. Reflexes sharpen. Fear disappears. And in some cases, the body becomes capable of feats it would never achieve under normal circumstances. Now add to that a flood of neurochemicals, adrenaline, noradrenaline, and endorphins. These are the brain's natural painkillers and performance enhancers. They dull the sensation of injury. They increase oxygen flow to the muscles. They make you faster, stronger, more focused. In short, they push you past the normal limits of endurance. It's a state we sometimes call fight or flight, though in the case of berserkers, there was never much flight. Only fight. And for them, it wasn't just a spike of stress, it was a deliberate ritual. A transformation. Before battle, berserkers were known to chant, bite their shields, and work themselves into a frenzy. Some accounts describe them as taking off their clothes, roaring like beasts, or dancing violently in place. These weren't random behaviors. They were techniques, possibly the Viking version of what elite athletes and soldiers now call mental conditioning. Modern military training borrows from the same principles. Soldiers are taught to override fear, to breathe through panic, to focus until every nerve is tuned to the present moment. In elite units, this training can go so far as to change the structure of the brain itself, strengthening the connections between reflex and action, dampening hesitation, erasing doubt. The Vikings, of course, didn't have neuroscience textbooks. But they had experience. Generation after generation of warriors, watching what worked and passing it on. Stories became traditions. Traditions became rituals. And rituals, when practiced enough, can reshape the mind. There's also the theory that some berserkers used substances to help induce the state. The fly agaric mushroom, a bright red fungus known for its psychoactive properties, has been suggested as one possible fuel. It causes hallucinations, heightened aggression, and reduced pain sensitivity. But it also causes nausea and impaired coordination, which makes it a risky tool for a warrior. The evidence is still debated, and perhaps that's the point. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a cocktail of belief, biology, and behavior. Because even without drugs, belief itself can be a powerful weapon. Placebo effects are real. So are expectation loops. If a warrior believed that entering a certain trance would make him invincible, his body might just respond accordingly. Fear is often what stops us. But if fear is removed, by ritual, by faith, by training, the body's limits stretch. Wounds are endured. Pain becomes irrelevant. And death, while still possible, loses its grip on the mind. That's what made berserkers so terrifying, not just their strength, but the way they seemed to move beyond the rules of normal human behavior. They weren't reckless. They were rewired. In a way, they were the first to tap into something we're only now beginning to understand, that the human brain, when pushed hard enough, can become something else entirely. And maybe that's why their stories have lasted. Because deep down, we recognize something in them. A glimpse of the power that lives in all of us, the version of ourselves that comes alive when it matters most. The one that steps in during crisis, lifts cars off children, or dives into burning buildings without a second thought. The one we don't fully control, but that might just save us when logic fails. The Vikings didn't need to name it. They just needed it to work. They howled. They trembled. They charged into battle like creatures born of chaos. But behind that chaos was something more ancient and more human than we ever guessed. Not madness, not magic, just the mind, unleashed. Harald Hardrada, the ultimate Viking warrior. If the Viking age had to end, it makes a kind of poetic sense that it ended with a man like Harald Hardrada. He was not just a Viking in the way we often imagine them, roaring into villages with an axe in each hand, eyes wild with fury. Harald was something more. A traveler. A thinker. A soldier of fortune and strategy. In many ways, he wasn't just a warrior of the North. He was a man of the world. And yet, he remained unmistakably Viking to the very end. Born into a noble family in Norway around the year 1015, Harald was just a teenager when he fought at the Battle of Stiklestad, where his half-brother, King Olaf, was killed in a failed bid to reclaim the throne. Wounded and forced into exile, Harald's life could have ended in obscurity, just another failed prince in a time of shifting loyalties and swordpoint politics. But Harald didn't vanish. He adapted. He crossed the seas, heading not west like many Vikings, but south and east. All the way to Constantinople, the shining heart of the Byzantine Empire. There, he joined the Varangian Guard, a legendary unit made up of Norse warriors who served as elite protectors of the emperor himself. These men weren't simple raiders. They were disciplined, battle-hardened, and trained in the advanced tactics of one of the most powerful armies in the world. Harald soaked it all in. Over the next decade, he traveled further than most of his countrymen could ever imagine. He fought in the Mediterranean. He stormed fortresses in Sicily. He marched across the Holy Land. And in all those battles, in every campaign, Harold was not just a fighter, he was a learner. He studied formations, supply lines, siegecraft, and strategy. While others chased coin, Harold gathered knowledge. He wasn't just becoming stronger. He was becoming smarter. By the time he returned to Scandinavia in his early 30s, Harold was no longer the exiled boy from Norway. He was a seasoned commander with the bearing of an emperor and the ambitions to match. And he had one goal: to claim the throne of Norway as his own. He did not come home quietly. With wealth from his years in Byzantine service, and a small army of loyal warriors, Harold began the careful process of building alliances, crushing rivals, and uniting Norway under his rule. He wasn't subtle, but he wasn't reckless either. He ruled like he fought, with boldness and precision. He strengthened Norway's defenses, centralized authority, and imposed laws that made him feared but respected. But Harold was never the kind of man to sit still. In 1066, hearing that the throne of England was up for grabs after the death of Edward the Confessor, Harold seized the chance to expand his legacy. He claimed that he had a right to the crown, one passed down through promises made between kings long gone. But the truth was simpler. He saw opportunity. And like any true Viking, he took it. He sailed to England with thousands of warriors, landing near the river Humber and striking fear into the countryside. At first, things went well. He crushed local resistance and took the city of York. But then came Stamford Bridge. It was late September when Harold's forces were surprised by the army of Harold Godwin's son, the English king who had marched his men over 180 miles in just 4 days to meet them. The Vikings, caught off guard in the heat of the day, were ill-prepared. Many had left their armor behind, expecting peace talks or a delayed engagement. The battle that followed was brutal. According to legend, a single Norse warrior held the narrow bridge for a time, cutting down scores of Englishmen before being brought down from beneath. It was brave, desperate, and ultimately futile. The tide turned swiftly. Despite all his experience, despite the discipline of his army and the fire in his blood, Harold was struck down in the chaos. An arrow, they say, pierced his throat. Just like that, it ended. The man who had fought on 3 continents, who had served emperors and kings, who had brought the cunning of the East into the heart of the North, fell in a muddy English field. And with him, something else fell, too. Stamford Bridge is often marked as the end of the Viking Age. Not because Vikings ceased to exist, but because the spirit of expansion, the hunger for new worlds, the fire that had burned for centuries in longships and mead halls and frost-covered hills, flickered out. After Harold, the age of the wandering Norse warlord gave way to the age of kings, borders, and kingdoms that stayed in place. But what a final chapter it was. Harald Hardrada was more than just the last great Viking. He was the full arc of the Viking story, born in the Old World, shaped by foreign lands, and driven by a vision of greatness that refused to shrink. He brought the North into conversation with the South, the East, and the world beyond. He was brutal, yes, but also brilliant. His campaigns were calculated. His reign was disciplined. And even in death, he left a mark that history could not ignore. So when we think of Vikings, not just the wild raiders, but the explorers, the strategists, the dreamers who rode beyond the edge of the known world, it's Harold's shadow we see on the horizon. The warrior who dared to be more. The last Viking. Why the berserkers disappeared. For generations, the image of a berserker haunted the minds of those who faced the Norsemen in battle, a howling warrior with wild eyes, swinging an axe with inhuman strength, seemingly immune to pain, fear, or mercy. They were legends made flesh, drawn from the icy forests of the north and baptized in the fires of chaos. But like all legends, even the fiercest ones fade. By the end of the Viking Age, something had begun to shift, not on the battlefield, but deep within the heart of Norse society. For centuries, berserkers had been honored, feared, even revered. They were believed to be chosen by Odin, the All-Father, favored by the god of war and death, their fury a divine gift. Their trance-like rage was not madness, it was something holy. Entire war bands followed berserkers into battle, hoping to harness the storm that lived inside them. But then came a new wind, blowing not from the north, but from the south. Christianity had begun to spread across Scandinavia. At first slowly, almost quietly, through travelers, priests, and alliances with Christian rulers abroad. But over time, it took firmer root. Kings were baptized. Churches were built. And with each generation, the old gods began to lose their hold. Where once Odin had been honored with feasts and blood sacrifices, now came a different god, a god of mercy, of order, of laws. And in this new vision of the world, the berserker had no place. The old rituals, those sacred preparations before battle, the howling, the trance dancing, the animal skins, these became suspect. No longer acts of divine connection, they were seen as pagan magic. Heresy. A threat to the new spiritual order. Christian leaders began to condemn berserker fury not as a gift from the gods, but as possession. Sin. Even witchcraft. In Iceland, one of the last strongholds of traditional Norse belief, this change was made law. The Gragas, a medieval legal code, spelled it out plainly: anyone who went berserk and endangered others in their madness could be outlawed, or worse, executed. What was once admired became a crime. What had once been a badge of divine favor was now something to be feared and purged. But the disappearance of the berserkers wasn't just about religion. The world around them was changing, too. Warfare itself was evolving. In the early days of Viking raiding, raw aggression and brute strength could turn the tide of a skirmish. Speed, surprise, and the chaos of hand-to-hand combat made berserkers ideal shock troops. They were terrifying, unpredictable, and in small-scale raids, that worked. But as kingdoms grew stronger and more organized, battles stopped being wild melees and started becoming planned encounters. Archers, cavalry, and formations began to dominate the field. Infantry worked together in tight ranks. Battles became less about fury and more about precision. A berserker, charging alone into a line of spears, no longer struck fear. He simply fell. The solitary, overwhelming force that once shattered enemy lines now looked reckless, even foolish. You couldn't win a war anymore with just a handful of enraged men. You needed strategy, coordination, and discipline. The battlefield had outgrown the berserker. Some tried to adapt. There are tales of former berserkers becoming bodyguards or champions in duels. A few may have even served as shock units in royal armies. But it wasn't the same. The rituals faded. The fury was buried. And slowly, over the years, the name berserker became more story than reality. By the time the last Viking strongholds had bowed to Christian rulers, the berserker had become a ghost. A memory. A tale told by firelight to wide-eyed children who had never seen a man in a wolfskin cloak lose himself to battle lust. They were remembered in sagas and carved into stone, their howls still echoing through the runes, but their place in the world was gone. And perhaps, in some quiet way, that was always going to happen. Societies change. Faiths evolve. The tools of war are always in motion. What once made sense in a world ruled by storms and blood oaths no longer fit in one ruled by kings, clerics, and courts of law. The berserker didn't fail. He simply belonged to another age. Still, the legend lingers. Today, we talk about going berserk as if it's just a figure of speech, a colorful way of describing someone losing control. But beneath that phrase lies a deep history, a reminder of men who believed their rage could connect them to the divine, who stripped away fear and pain to become something more than human, even if only for a moment. They may no longer walk among us, but their spirit endures in stories, in sagas, and in the strange truth that even the most primal fury once had its place in the heart of a changing world. The berserker faded, yes. But he didn't vanish. He was simply left behind, as the world moved forward, an unforgettable legacy. The berserkers are gone. The Ulfhednar too. Their chants have quieted, their rituals ended, their fury absorbed into the long shadows of history. But strangely, they've never truly left us. Even today, the image of the berserker lingers. It lives in our stories, in our screens, in the deep corners of our imagination. It surfaces in movies where soldiers charge into hopeless odds with eyes blazing and hearts unbreakable. It pulses through video games, where characters harness primal rage to push beyond human limits. It finds its way into modern military training manuals and endurance psychology studies, quiet echoes of men who once painted their bodies, donned animal skins, and entered battle like thunder made flesh. Because the berserker isn't just a relic of the Viking Age. It's a symbol. A question. A whisper in the back of our minds that asks, what might we become if we let go of fear? If we pushed past the natural boundaries of body and mind? If we summoned something deeper, something older? Science, of course, has tried to make sense of it. Neuroscience tells us about the suppression of the prefrontal cortex, the release of endorphins and adrenaline, the numbing of pain, the narrowing of focus. It's all explained now, in charts and scans and neatly labeled diagrams. The berserker state, once thought to be a sacred trance, has become a neurological phenomenon. A system that can be studied. Maybe even replicated. And modern institutions have listened. Military trainers speak of combat flow states, where soldiers move with fluid instinct, reacting before they think. Athletes talk about entering the zone, where every movement feels effortless, and time seems to slow down. Even in tech and business, there's talk of biohacking, of unlocking new levels of productivity, endurance, control. The language is different, but the aim is eerily familiar, to go beyond. In a way, we've never stopped chasing the berserker. But here's the twist, now we do it with heart monitors and data sets instead of meat and mushroom-laced rituals. We look for the edge not in the forest, but in the lab. We seek that same burst of clarity, of strength, of complete surrender to the moment, just packaged for modern life. And yet, even as we pursue that power, a quieter question follows us. What do we lose when we let go of control? The berserker gave up his fear, yes, but also his self. He became a vessel for something else. Something wild. Something he could not always command once it had been awakened. That loss of self, of identity, of reason, is what made him so dangerous. Not just to enemies, but sometimes to his own kin. That was always the price of the rage. So when we ask if we can become super soldiers or mental warriors, we must also ask, what part of our humanity are we willing to silence? Because the berserker's path was never one of balance. It was one of surrender. Total. Absolute. It demanded the whole of a man, his fear, his empathy, his memory of home. And though it made him powerful, it also left him alone. Feared. Sometimes even hated. In stories, they return from war not as heroes, but as ghosts. This is where the legend turns inward. The berserker becomes less about battlefields and more about choices. About that line we all walk between instinct and discipline, between fury and calm, between the animal in us and the person we hope to be. We see flashes of it in daily life, in moments of rage we regret, in acts of courage we can't explain. We glimpse it when stress pushes us to the edge, and something deeper rises to carry us forward. So maybe the legacy of the berserker isn't just about combat or ancient rituals. Maybe it's a mirror. One that asks us to look honestly at what lives beneath our civilized skin. What might awaken if the world fell apart? What might we become if we were desperate enough, angry enough, or afraid enough? And more importantly, if we found that strength, would we still be ourselves? That's the part of the story that never gets old, because every age has its berserkers. They just wear different armor. In some places, they fight with fists. In others, They endure endless shifts in hospitals, or push through wildfires, or race into chaos while others run away. They don't always scream. They don't always look mad. But somewhere deep down, they too have touched the edge, and come back changed. The difference now is that we know what the cost can be. We're wiser, maybe. More careful. But the hunger remains, so we tell stories. Not to glorify the rage, but to remember its shape. To study it. To ask if it still has a place in the world we're building. And when we speak of the berserker now, it's no longer just with awe or fear. It's with curiosity. With a kind of reluctant respect. Because the men who howled for Odin under a midnight sky have left behind more than songs or symbols, they've left behind a challenge. Can you harness the fire without letting it consume you? Can you push past your limits without losing your soul? It's not just a Viking question. It's a human one. And maybe that's why, all these centuries later, we still haven't stopped asking it. So, what do you think? Were the berserkers powered by ancient magic, or were they just tapping into something deep inside the human mind? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. We'd love to hear what you believe. And if you enjoy stories that blend mystery, history, and a touch of the unknown, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join us here at Thursday Na Storytime. We've got plenty more hidden tales and fascinating journeys coming your way. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay brave, and keep exploring the past with us.